What is your name? Where and what do you teach? And how long have you been an educator?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Mark Hearn. I go by he, him, his pronouns. And I teach at Church Divinity School of the Pacific in Berkeley, California. I am the associate professor and director of contextual education here. And I've been an educator in higher education for the last 14 years at 3 different institutions. Most recently, prior to coming here this fall, Seattle University and the School of Theology and Ministry. I am also second generation Korean American, although my name, last name of Hearn does not reflect this. It's actually Han, and my dad, when he immigrated to this country back in the 1950s, he changed the name from Han to Hearn. And so I grew up a pastor's kid in a Korean immigrant church, and really learned to love God and come to faith and really help people through that experience being in a Korean immigrant church.
What are some of the challenges that you or your students experienced in the past or are dealing with right now?
Yeah, I think for everybody in particular, this past spring was particularly difficult, given the coronavirus pandemic, and then eventually the pandemic of Black lives being unnecessarily beaten and murdered. Mm-hmm. And so I think because of those two, and those two being both intertwined and also simultaneous, almost really at the same time, it just made for a really acute time this past spring, I think, for everybody. And it threw all of our systems of education into disruption, I think more so for some than for others. And what I mean by that is that it threw everything online and in a hurry. So if you were not already online, then it really threw you for a loop. Mm-hmm. I think because of that, because it throwing teachers for a loop, I think in some ways it also threw students for a loop, although I think students were themselves already being disrupted in everything that they were going through too. And so there was instant chaos and instant disruption. Mm-hmm. On top of what I think already a student, a faculty member already normally brings into the classroom situation, in any course, any quarter or semester. So it just really, I think, intensified just a lot of our inability, I guess you can put it, to deal with anxiety, mm-hmm. to deal with disruptions in our lives, to deal with the fast-pacedness of what our society, I think our culture faces anyway. And then on top of that, then you also throw in things like isolation, because now you're having to physically distance from other people, and you're also having to find different ways to socially interact now with people through a digital medium or media that you weren't used to before. So I know that students were dealing a lot with fatigue. I was dealing with fatigue, right? And the Zoom fatigue phenomena, I don't think that was just something that we made up. It was something that we were actually feeling embodied. So I think those things were some of the new challenges for us. And then I think for us, even myself, who is an introvert, but professionally, I have to kind of be more outgoing. And I don't necessarily identify introvertedness or extrovertedness as are you talkative and outgoing, or do you like to be by yourself? It's more of like, when you are depleted with your energy, where do you need to go? And do you need to be with other people, or do you need to pull away by yourself? And so for me, even as an introvert, I felt a lot of that isolation in not being able to be embodied with people in class together in person. And I imagine that my students were also feeling that. And now I think that put another challenge of trying to figure out what it means to be human and what it means to be human in community together, but over digital technology, you know. And so those were a couple of, I think, things that students were dealing with. You know, I think also this public and private space was now flattened, and it was all integrated and meshed together, so that now you're on a Zoom call or on a, you know, live stream call or whatever it is, and you have people running in the background. You have everybody in your household, for instance, that might be on Zoom, and the bandwidth then goes down. So all of these things that you normally wouldn't have if you were going out into your workspace or into your school space, now all of those things are amplified and intensified because of something like COVID and being isolated in home. So those are a few of the things that I think we were dealing with in the past spring. And in some ways, even now into the fall, although, you know, I think people are a little bit more adjusted that way.
Is there a specific, like, embarrassing Zoom bomb or something that happened that comes to mind?
No, not specifically for me, because I was educated and trained well and have heard so many of the, I think, the horror stories of faith communities getting together, for instance, and not having a password or making their link available to the whole world, basically, on the internet, and having some really unfortunate, I think, Zoom bombs that have gone on, but not for me, fortunately. I think there was one really funny moment, though, and that was, you know, talking about melding the private and the public space together. I was getting ready for a call last spring, and I was teaching an undergraduate course at Seattle U, and, you know, all the students popped up and populated on my screen. And then I had one student who was driving from wherever he was back home, and he, you know, faithfully logged in, but he was logging in while he was driving, and he didn't have the mute on, and we can hear his, you know, the throttle going up and then shifting gears and so forth. And, you know, it kind of made me pause a little bit and go, what's going on? And the other students in the class also had a good laugh with that too.
You've touched on a lot of these things, but anything else that you want people to know about teaching in a pandemic?
Yeah, you know, I think, you know, I'll take it from the perspective of the teacher, right? And so I think this idea that there's no new normal is something that I wish more people would understand. I think we intuitively know this and feel this, but because there's no if there was a new normal, we can all adjust. But it seems like the new normal continues to keep moving around, and we don't know where exactly to put our finger and say, this is the new normal and this is the new norm. So I think that's one thing, is that there is no new normal right now. And as a result of that, and this is coming from the teacher side, the faculty side, last spring we had to make shifts. I mean, not just myself, but educators all across the board had to make shifts on, you know, just like that. And they were having to deal with their own family situations, households, in making the shift. And so it's not making an excuse as much as it is, you know, for me, teaching is about an embodied vocation. And it's like I'm bringing my whole life into teaching. And because of that, I had to, you know, try as best as I can to kind of fragment or pause everything that was going on with me. And I'd imagine this was probably true for many educators. What was going on with your own life and how you're processing the pandemic and the pandemics that were going on, while then you were also then having to prepare to get up and running as fast as possible, and then to teach a course around the content matter for students who are also dealing with all of this as well. And so, it just made for a really complex situation. I don't know that teachers were our best selves, the last spring. And I think oftentimes what we want is to be able to do this work from our best selves and with our best selves. And I just know, for myself, that was not my best self. And yet I was trying, I was trying to do as best I could with it. And for the most part, if I evaluate myself now about last spring, I think I did about as best I could. But I do know that it was the best self that I could give that wasn't in our standard normalcy, right? It was more of the best self that I could give in this crazy disruptions. And so, that kind of humanizes, I hope, for the listeners, just a little bit about what was going on this side, at least, of the equation with regards to education and pedagogy.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because you hear about teachers who, for instance, might live in the neighborhoods that they teach in, and then their students, they have a certain rapport and dynamic already established in the classroom. But then it's like when you see your teacher at the supermarket or something, then they're like, oh yeah, like they're totally a human being as well. And I like how you juxtapose that. Like they're also, you all, educators are all dealing with this, but from the student's perspective, it seems like we're just so wrapped up on the paperwork and the things that are due, and not seeing the teacher as also living in a pandemic as well.
Yeah. So, practically then it was things like, how much time do I actually have people get on synchronous calls when I know that they're all on synchronous calls, and myself have been on synchronous calls and I'm zoomed out, I'm fatigued, right? So that coupled with then some students might wonder, like, why are we not spending more time on synchronous calls together, right? And if we get into the kind of the capitalization of education, then it's almost like, well, I'm paying good money for this. Why are we not on Zoom calls longer? And so there was always this balance, I think, that I still ask myself the question, although I think this semester, this fall quarter, I've been able to kind of think through some things a little bit more and establish some things. There's more of a ramp up, right? A ramp to the beginning of the quarter or the semester. But back then it was almost like you're having to almost in just real time make these decisions about how much time are we going to spend in the class together on Zoom together, or how much am I flexible? And so a lot of it was asking really of me to be very intuitive and to tap into my sensibilities. I think for me as a pastor, as a minister, as a clergy member who does their ministerial work in the field of education and higher education, it was asking of me to tap into a lot of my sensibilities of being able to read the room, for instance, being able to explicitly ask students and say, okay, let's do a midweek check-in right now and say, how much time is too much time? Or mid-quarter check-in, how much time is too much time? What's the perfect medium here for us to be able to spend on this call, right? And so these are all just things that we kind of had to do and figure out as we were going along. Whereas I think most of the time, again, in a normal situation, you have a lot more time in between to be able to adjust and to make those adjustments if needed. So, it's definitely a different situation teaching right now and being an educator in COVID.
Well, are there still any joys of being a teacher right now?
Yeah, there are. So I got my evaluations, right? Every educator gets evaluations at the end of their class, right? And I eventually got my evaluations and read through those and was really appreciative of students who acknowledged and that this was a difficult situation for everybody involved, right? And even in that was able to give specific feedback. You know, and obviously as an educator, as a human being, we always go to the praise. We like that. And so, you know, I dwelled on that. And that was really rich for me to be able to read through and to kind of just sit with. You know, again, I think given who I am as a human being during this educative process and upheaval. So that's one of the joys, is just being able to hear from students. But I think one of the other greater joys for me is that when I'm actually in a class together with students, and I think, again, last spring was such an upheaval that we had to adjust. This fall, I think people know better going into it what it can be and are expected or more adjusted in what their expectations are. So I think I sense that more people are ready to engage than maybe perhaps last spring, in the sense that we were just trying to adjust. And this spring, so when I have conversations this fall with students, and you can be able to see students really engage the material and not then allow digital medium and technology to be a stumbling block or a challenge or an obstacle, but to say, okay, this is it. Then I know that students are adjusting, I'm adjusting, and then we can get to the conversations and to the learning as a community together that we really need to get to. And so that's exciting for me. I mean, that brings a lot of joy, is that students are ready to come in and they're saying, okay, let's do this. The other joy, really, I think, out of all of this is that this is, you know, and especially in my field of theological higher education, and really talking about matters of faith and existence and of the church and theology and so forth. For students to bring in these questions that we are facing right now with regards to the pandemics, right? And I think there's not only two pandemics, but I think there's a rising third pandemic, and that is the financial crises and the lack of employment for a lot of people, especially I think the millennial and the Z generations. You know, I think for students to bring those questions in and to really question and to force, I guess in some ways, and I say that in the best sense of the word, force the questions to be asked about theology, about the church, about faith matters. I think that really is a joy of mine. I don't know the answers all the time, nor do I pretend to know the answers, but to know that we have this community together where we are wrestling, engaging these questions together, that they are bringing from their own context and from the global context and the national context, man, that's exciting. Because then I know this is worth it, and this is the space for us to talk about our faith matters with what's going on in the world today. And so that those things bring me joy, you know.
That's beautiful.
As well as, you know, the occasional thank you from a student, right? That's all, that always brings me joy.
I know you said that there was no new normal, or that everyone's trying to figure what that out is, but it sounds like, I feel like it sounds like you've gotten a taste of what this new normal could look like.
Yeah. You know, yeah, I mean, I think in terms of teaching wise, yeah, you there's a calibration, I think, that goes on. Mm-hmm. And you realize what you can do and what your capacities are, whether that be like skilled technological capacities with like a learning management system, an LMS like Canvas or Moodle or whatever it is. So I think there's that calibration of knowing what I can or cannot do. But I think there's also a calibration of what's my emotional space as an educator coming into this new semester or quarter, right? Mm-hmm. And in that sense, my brain, my mind, and my heart was able to breathe just a little bit, you know, between last spring and this fall. And in that sense, I can adjust a little bit easier, right? So whereas at the end of last year, it was like, man, we have to just get everything out and done and completed and graded and all of these different things. And there just wasn't much space to do that. And so maybe calling it a new normal, I don't know, but at least my capacity to adjust and be nimble and agile, that has increased a little bit more because I had a little bit of the summer to kind of think through some of these things.
Last question. How can others support you as an educator?
You know, I think to say thanks, that's a good start. You know, I think getting back to what I've shared already, that, you know, education really is an endeavor. It's a project of human beings helping to facilitate learning with other human beings. And so the more that we can understand that we are human beings, even if we are the bearer of the power to grade, most people, okay, let me put it this way. Most faculty members and educators I talk to, the thing that they dislike the most about teaching and being an educator is grading. That doesn't mean that we dislike reading papers and reading projects and watching projects and learning what our students have learned. But it does mean that we don't get into this profession and this vocation so that we can bear the power to grade, right? It's so that there is, I think for the most part, most educators I know, it's so that we get into this profession and this vocation because we want to help lives to be unearthed and to blossom and to grow and to be part of this co-learning project and endeavor together. And so that can only happen, I think, in the best way if we all understand that we are all human beings in this education together. Now, I understand that my professional roles call me to certain things, and it doesn't mean that I just bare my soul to my class. No, it does mean, though, that we understand that everybody has a story that they're bringing into that classroom, not only that semester or quarter, but that day. And so for us to hold each other, I think, with gentle compassion in that moment together. And so, you know, that's what I think one of the ways that people can support me and other educators is to know that we are all human beings in this endeavor together. And I would also say, you know, because I'm a person of faith, I would also say to your viewers and listeners of this that to keep us in prayer, to keep me in prayer, you know, to keep my integrity, I think, and the integrity of all educators in prayer, that when we do come into a class, that we would understand that everybody has certain lives that they're bringing into the place, and also that we have a great call to also bring content theory with the actual lived experiences with people's lives together. And that really is a great call. And so for your prayers, I covet, and I'm sure that other educators covet as well. And so I think those two things.
Well, Mark, again, thank you for your time, but also thank you for truly being a good teacher. I bet you have some really funny and meaningful evaluations that will help weather some of this craziness that we're experiencing.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's good to be with you all on this call.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Aya.
You can get some funny B-roll footage too while we're recording. Perfect.
You mentioned it twice now, Tom.
It's just like the books are like HD quality, and then you're like a 360 pixel, 360p.
It's my Jedi silhouette.
Yeah, for real.
I've died and I'm a Jedi ghost now. Yeah.